Human trafficking, when you're looking at classification of a crime under the California Penal Code, its seriousness in its classification, it's on the same level as car theft, vandalism. Someone goes and busts someone's window and the window costs you $500 to fix or something. You are on the same level of seriousness with busting someone's, expensive window or keying their car as you are with selling a child 10 times a day for the last year and a half. You two are equal in seriousness under California law.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Light in the Darkness podcast, where we speak life and shine light on the issue of human trafficking. My name is Hillary. I'm a Zoe staff member here. And today I am with the one and only Dave Cox. He's a COO here, worked at Zoe for several years. And today we're just going to chime in about how serious the issue of human trafficking is. So Dave, take it away.
Well, Thank you so much. And I want to introduce a guest that we've been excited to introduce to all those who listen. And he's a champion in the field of human trafficking. His name's Tyson McCoy. And Tyson has a legal background. But Tyson, I'm going to go ahead and bounce it over to you. Can you share some of your professional background with all those listening? Yeah.
Sure. Thanks for having me on. So I'm a deputy district attorney. I've been a prosecutor for a little over 11 years now. I've worked in Kern County, the city of San Diego, and the county of Merced as a prosecutor. Most recently, I've been working on human trafficking as my primary kind of focus, and that's been about the last 4 years. I was a chief deputy up in Merced County and created a human trafficking unit up there. And then I transferred down to Kern County about 2 years ago, and then I helped develop the first human trafficking task force in Kern County, and that's been active for about the last 2 years. I've tried a little bit of every type of case. I do homicides, I've done child molestation, domestic violence, gangs, human trafficking, pretty much you name it. But now my focus is all human trafficking with the exception of a homicide here or there.
It's a fantastic background. I guess I would love for people to hear, like when you think of human trafficking, when you started prosecuting these cases, what was surprising to you?
I had spent probably, before getting into human trafficking, I spent probably about 4 or 5 years in gangs. And so gangs was the majority of my career. And I was just kind of shocked at the pervasiveness of the problem and also the viciousness of the perpetrators, and then also just the vulnerability of the victims, and just how much this crime has gone unnoticed in mainstream society, and how how misunderstood it is. A lot of people, I think, they talk about human trafficking. They talk about, I want to be I'm an abolitionist and I want to fight the selling of people. But I think a lot of people don't have an understanding of what, domestic trafficking is, in particular sex trafficking. And so that really spurred me to get really involved in the movement to make this much more mainstream, both in law enforcement and also in the public.
Yeah. And I know even in the area of law enforcement, there's been a lot of reform, even on the way they approach it. There's an understanding of the victim. So a victim-centered approach has really moved forward in law enforcement, and it sounds like even in the court system as well. So a victim-centered approach. Have you seen that as well?
Yeah, I have. And we're still very much in that transition in a lot of places, but there's a lot of places that are doing great work in this. I know in our county, we did a lot of training over the last couple of years to really get that down. And we've seen a huge influx of cases, and we've also seen a huge partnership with victim service providers and survivors. And so I spend a lot of my time doing trainings, not just in Kern County, but across the state. And so we're really trying to move that needle from identifying, I call it the Wizard of Oz syndrome, where for years we weren't looking at who was behind the curtain. We were looking at the victims and we weren't paying attention to the trafficker. And now we're really focused on the trafficker and seeing the victims in their rightful place as being victims and, manipulated by the person behind the curtain, so to speak.
A lot of people, when they think of human trafficking, how serious is it and how violent is it? How would you respond to that?
It's super serious, and super violent. I don't think a lot of people realize a lot of these offenders have violent criminal histories. On my caseload, over 50% of my defendants that I'm prosecuting have a previous strike conviction. That's a very high percentage. And so a lot of these guys have a prior, assault or robbery, something that's obviously a strike. And so the victims are dealing with people with a history of that. And then the nature of the crime, it's just so vicious in the sense of a lot of the victims, they start as children. So, I mean, most of my victims who are even adults were brought in as children. And so the psychological impact of that damage that happens to these young victims, it's so huge. I can't think of the word right now, but I told the judge in my last case at sentencing, I'm like, there's a lot of victims that will fully recover, and the recovery won't be a super intensive process. But human trafficking victims, it's a question whether they will fully recover. Now, they can recover and live great lives. I've worked with survivors who are doing great, but there's a lot of victims that never recover. They become addicted to drugs. They become suicidal. They cannot overcome the mental damage that has been done to them for being trafficked. And that's what's so vicious about this, is that traffickers leave a wasteland of victims and people whose lives have been totally derailed, and that they spend the rest of their life recovering. One survivor told me the hardest part about being trafficked was the pathway out. That was the most difficult part. But going back to not only psychological, but physical violence, I mean, assault with deadly weapon, choking, strangling, beatings, ice baths, branding, the tattooing of victims with the perpetrators' names, the burning them with cigarettes, burning them with other things. So it's a very vicious crime. And I don't think people realize just how bad it is. And especially in the state, one thing that I've come to kind of realize is that in Sacramento, I don't think there's a really good understanding of what sex trafficking is. I think everyone thinks it's consensual, and that's just a lie.
Yeah, I think it's, we would agree with everything you're talking about. I know, Hillary, you've worked direct care. A lot of our team at Zoe does direct care, works with kids, and we hear stories, and we've seen how serious, how violent it gets. How would you respond to it? How serious and violent can human trafficking be? And just from what we've seen with the kids we work with, or other advocates and direct care workers, what they've seen.
Yeah, it's incredibly serious and violent. I think for myself in the field working with the girls, what was most shocking for me was really the psychological piece that you were talking about, Tyson, of how much of an effect it has on them, even when they're not in the life anymore, or they're no longer in contact with an exploiter, or just even the transition of trying to separate themselves, seeing how much they've been manipulated and groomed and abused into thinking that that's normal or that's what they deserve. And so I've had girls as young as 12 years old, 13 years old, talking to me about being pistol whipped, jumping out of cars, moving vehicles at that, because of threats to their life. I've heard them talk about being forced to take drugs, just so many different things that any person to experience would be horrific. But for somebody so young to have already dealt with so many traumas, it's devastating. And it's this understanding that while we can do everything in our power to come alongside them and help them find restoration, there's a difficulty in that I can't even put words to, really, because there's so many strongholds and hurdles that these survivors have to work through. So that's my take on it, are the long-term effects of the violence, and how even when they're no longer physically being abused, that the mental strongholds that they deal with, that seems like it'll be a lifelong effort to break those.
So I think just hearing all this, one thing people may not realize is kids could be raped 30 times a day. That's radical trauma. It creates trauma bonding, let alone all the violence that both of you just mentioned. Tyson, when we talk to people and they hear this, they're like, oh, good. I'm so glad this trafficker got arrested. They're going to be locked up for a long time. We know that we have cases where kids are terrified because their perpetrator is back out on the streets. And people say, how can that happen? Like, there's no way that should actually happen. So what is taking place in the court system? What are the crimes? I mean, what's the typical sentencing for human trafficking and length of stay? And how are people able to get arrested for this and then back out on the streets so quickly?
And that's a great question. And this is something that is really misunderstood and not known about in the public, just because this kind of technicality doesn't really come up in a lot of conversations about the criminal justice system. And so just right off the bat, just so everyone knows, in California, human trafficking is punished in the following ways. If you human traffic an adult, there's three options a judge has. The low prison term is 8 years, the middle prison term is 14 years, and the upper term is 20 years. The judge can also grant probation if he chooses to. Human trafficking of a child starts at the low term of 5 years, a middle term of 8 years, and an upper term of 12 years. If you have an enhancement on the child, such as the trafficker used force, fraud, coercion, duress, there's a variety of things, then you can potentially get a life sentence. But the reality is what happens in the prisons versus what is written in the penal code are two different things. And as far as actual time spent. So human trafficking, except for the minor with the enhancement, the trafficker is going to start right out of the gate when he goes to prison at 50% good conduct credits. So say he gets the middle term for trafficking a child of 8 years, he's going to start out with good conduct credits of being eligible for release after 4 years. Okay, so that's already shaved in half. And then the California Department of Corrections also has a lot of other credits. There's educational merit credits. There's milestone credits for being in custody. You have there's rehabilitative credits. There's a variety of these credits that can add additional time or take additional time off your sentence. And so what you can see is that they start out at halftime, and then when you add these other credits, they can get lower than that. So you can have someone that's sentenced to, say, they got the upper term on a child trafficking case of 12 years. They went down to 6 years for halftime, and then they had some credits, additional credits that they got while in CDC. They could get out, in 4 or 5 years. And we've seen early kicks where people have been kicked out earlier. And so the reality is when they go up into the prison system, it's not anywhere what's written on paper. So when people hear in the news, they got 30 years, they're going to be gone for that long. The reality is they'll probably have a parole date within, 12 to 13 years is probably when they'll have their parole date, if not sooner.
Mm. And what about those lesser sentencing? I heard you say 5 and 8. If it was 5 or 8, how long, or what's the earliest somebody would likely be eligible for one of those sentences?
Yeah, so if it's 5 years, they're starting right out of the gate at 2.5 with good conduct credits. And so, and then they can have their additional credits. So they can be out in less than 2 years in reality. So I would expect, based on what I see, if a person was sentenced to California for trafficking a child, he got the low term of 5 years, I would expect him to probably get paroled around 2 years, based on what I see and anticipate with the credits. And so it's not nearly the time that they're expecting. I think I just convicted a repeat trafficker. He got 27 years, 8 months. He had trafficked multiple minors and pimped out an adult. He had been previously convicted of trafficking in 2017 when he had trafficked a minor there. I think his parole date, even though he was sentenced to 27 years, I think his parole date is in about 9 or 10 years.
Wow. I mean, that's shocking.
Yeah, it's and that's kind of the thing, is people aren't paying attention to what's going on the backside. And I don't think people understand, we're shutting down prisons in California. We're not only shutting down prisons, we're shutting down like wings of prisons. And so we have prisons that are open, but then like wings of those prisons are shut down. And so California is on a full course towards eliminating punishment as a form of justice. And so there's people that in this state that don't find incarceration to be effective in any shape or form, and that do not want people in prison at all.
Can I ask you a question to just as far as crime classifications? So human trafficking, it's a felony, but it's not considered a serious felony, which seems shocking. And you could help explain what that terminology even means. And since it's not considered a serious felony, what other crimes are considered a serious felony? In other words, they have a higher, criminal sentencing than human trafficking that you think the audience would be most shocked to hear.
Yeah, so it's really shocking. When I train people, I talk about human trafficking as a house of horrors. It's a crime that has a bunch of other very violent crimes within that crime. So, a human trafficking victim will suffer rape. They will suffer torture. They will suffer mayhem. They will suffer assault. They will suffer criminal threats. They will suffer all kinds of other crimes while they are being trafficked. But our legislature has refused to identify human trafficking as being serious or violent. And so human trafficking, when you're looking at classification of a crime under the California Penal Code, its seriousness in its classification, it's on the same level as drug sales, car theft, vandalism. Someone goes and busts someone's window, and the window costs, $500 to fix or something. You are on the same level of seriousness with busting someone's, expensive window or keying their car as you are with selling a child 10 times a day for the last year and a half. You two are equal in seriousness under California law. And it's a total absurdity. And so give you an example of other crimes. You had asked about crimes that are classified as serious. If you threaten someone with great bodily injury or death, that's what's known as criminal threats. That's a strike. That's a serious crime. You use a deadly weapon against somebody, that's a strike. You do a home burglary, you go in someone's house, even if they're not home, and you steal something or you attempted to take something from their house, that is a serious crime. But you sell a child to all these men multiple times a day. You psychologically control them where you are literally have a noose around their neck psychologically. And you own that child for all intents and purposes. And you profit off of them, thousands of dollars a month. You are a non-serious, non-violent criminal offender under California state law.
That is absolutely shocking.
Heartbreaking.
It is heartbreaking. And I think behind the scenes right now, there is work being done to change that. And we've heard about Senate Bill 14. Could you share about some efforts being done to reclassify human trafficking this year?
Yes, so there's a number of legislators that are trying to get this changed. One of the bills that has been authored is by our local senator in Kern County, Senator Shannon Grove, which is SB14. My elected district attorney, Cynthia Zimmer, is the sponsor of the bill. It's the second time we've tried to do this. We're trying to get human trafficking added to the list of serious and violent crimes. And Senator Grove just recently amended the bill. So when the bill was initially submitted this year, it was to amend the law to make human trafficking both serious and violent. So there's two lists in the penal code. One's a list of serious crimes, one's a list of violent crimes. Both of those lists are what's known as strikes under California's 3 strikes law. Senator Grove has amended the bill because of the difficulties we are having in Sacramento with getting this bill passed. She's amended it to just be serious in the hopes that we can get some people who are opposing the bill to at least define this crime as serious, even though it wouldn't be defined as violent. That would still give us the strike, which would allow us to add additional time when they commit a new felony. So if this bill were to pass, if a perpetrator were to sell a child, he got convicted and it was a strike, and he gets out and he was caught selling another person, human trafficking them, that their sentence would be doubled under the 3 strikes law. So instead of that, 5, 8, 12 year for a child, it would be 10, 16, 22 years a potential punishment. So it really targets recidivists by having this crime be serious. And so that's why it's important, because we have seen a good number of recidivist offenders in this area.
What would be, it seems to make such sense. I mean, after hearing crime classifications like you talked about, that the fact that you're selling kids on the street, that's considered non-serious. I think that's where, when we've talked to people are shocked when they hear that. It seems pretty absurd. There are people that do oppose it, and what would be their arguments for opposing it?
This year, their arguments are going to be slightly different. When we did it last year, there was a concern about the victim who becomes kind of a victim perpetrator hybrid, so to speak. And that's what's commonly referred to in the business as the bottom. And I won't use the derogatory term to that. But a victim who is brought in, victimized, and then the trafficker then has that person become like an enforcer and a recruiter within the trafficker's sphere of slavery. That is no longer an issue this year, because if we don't make it a violent crime, that person can always seek vacatur relief under the penal code to say that we were forced to do this as a trafficking victim. And there's a penal code section that says you can get relief from the conviction because of that. And so this year, I think the primary opposition for those that are opposing this, now that it's only a serious crime, is their opposition to incarceration as a form of punishment. A bill went through, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, the Assembly, to make human trafficking a violent crime in the Assembly. So for those that may not know, you can get a bill in through the Senate or the Assembly, and it can work its way through both chambers of Congress. And so one way is through the Assembly. One of the Democrat commentators on this bill was actually really shocked me. He made a comment, something to the effect, as they rejected this bill and shot it down, something effective: "I'm getting really tired of these type of bills coming forward." And that will tell you how dismissive and how adverse a lot of these legislators are in Sacramento to anything that increases punishment, even if it means sacrificing children on the altar of slavery for their own ideological agenda. And that's all this is. And I don't mean to get, I'm not trying to get political, but the reality is, when you're in Sacramento, you cannot escape the politics, because it is a political arena.
A question came to mind. So Tyson, in my experience, I've had interactions with survivors, and a lot of the girls at some point have opened up to us as staff and maybe talked a bit about some of their interactions with an exploiter, but have expressed a lot of fear and concern testifying against them. So just as somebody listening to this, how important is witness testimony in prosecuting these cases? And could the passing of SB14 help more victims feel more confident coming forward if they were to believe there's more severe consequences?
With the victims, it's a lifestyle of feeling unnoticed, unimportant, trash, worthless. The trafficker, as you know, ingrains in the victim that they are not important. Society does not care about them. Their parents don't care about them. Their friends don't care about them. And that's one of the reasons why victims don't run away, is because they have nowhere to go. They've been tossed aside, whether it's by home, the social service system, whether it was a law enforcement officer that treated them like a prostitute instead of a victim. And so they're in a state of, no one cares about me. I have nowhere to go. I might as well stay with my trafficker. And when it gets to the courts and we finally get the right scenario where law enforcement has identified this as a victim, a trained officer has gotten involved, a victim service provider who is trained has gotten involved, and they're now working with the victim and they're getting them services. So for the first time in their life, they're starting to see people actually that see them for who they really are. They are not a piece of trash. They are not a hoe. They are not a hooker. They are a valued person that's been extremely victimized and brutalized. When we get them to this stage and they are building the courage to testify, and we have to have conversations with them about punishment and about potential release dates of the victim, of the defendant, and they hear that this crime is not serious under California law. They hear that the person will get a lot of credits. They will probably be released and recycled and be out fairly quickly. It's demoralizing for the victim. It is secondary trauma for the victim, because they're like, I've gone through all this. I'm trying to work with the police and build up the courage, even though my life may be in danger. I may fear my family's in danger. But he's going to get out in 2 or 3 years. Like, this isn't worth it. It's not worth it. And so that makes it very hard. And one of the things that legislators always say to us is like, oh, well, you have the ability to charge other crimes. So like, you could charge something that is a strike, and so we don't really need this. But the reality is that lacks a total understanding of the difficulties of proving a case like this, because it's very difficult to prove things like rape or assault with a deadly weapon, criminal threats, if the victim is not cooperating, because the jury is going to say, well, this victim's all over the place, and I'm not going to take her word for it. She's a mess, and so I'm not going to find guilt based on just what one person says. And so without her cooperation and being able to work with the police to help get us the evidence we need, these are very difficult cases. And fundamentally, at its core, I think it's a slap in the face to these victims when they come forward after living a life that's just brutal, and then to tell them, I'm sorry, California does not view you as a victim of a serious crime.
Well, Tyson, thank you for noticing. Thank you for speaking value into the most victimized in our communities, our kids who've been victimized. And we see them, you see them, and there are people that are really trying to elevate the status of the crime, not the status, but the seriousness of the crime by labeling it a serious crime. If people want to get behind that effort, what could they do?
You can Google Senate Bill 14, California human trafficking. You can also put in Senator Grove. Senator Grove has a whole landing page on her Senate page dedicated to SB14. And on that page, there's a petition link that you can sign. That petition will be given to the members of the California Senate Public Safety Committee who will vote on the bill. You can also contact the members of the committee. And so this bill has to get the majority vote of the committee for it to be allowed to proceed in the legislative process. And so we haven't been able to get this bill out of this Senate Public Safety Committee. And so there's 5 senators, and you can go on the Google California Senate Public Safety Committee. You want to go to the Senate one. And then you can call those senators, share this information on social media with your friends. You can show up to the Capitol when it goes to vote. You can actually go in front of the Senate members and say, I support this bill. You can call in, and Senator Grove will post that information on her social media website. And so if you can't make the drive, you can call in. Last year, Zoe had a huge role in the number of calls and the number of people that showed up. And even though we didn't get the bill passed last year, everyone I talked to said that they had never seen a hearing like that before, with the amount of support that had come forward. And I do think we have a slightly different makeup in the Senate Public Safety Committee this year. We have a new chair of the Public Safety Committee. I'm hopeful that she will support this bill. And so that slight change could make a difference in how this bill turns out.
Well, thank you again. Thanks for informing us and just even explaining that it's a two-stage approach. One, it has to get passed a small committee of 5 senators first, the safety committee, and then it goes to the General Assembly if it passes that committee. So is that accurate?
So it will, there's actually another step. So if we get out of the public safety, it will go to the Appropriations Committee, which is like a budget committee.
Okay.
And then we'll need to get out of appropriations. If we can get out of appropriations, it will then go to the floor of the Senate for a vote from all the members of the Senate. If it passes the floor of the Senate, then it moves into the House. And then it will do that same process through the House. And then it would go to the governor's desk after that. So it is a long process, but it is a battle. I think that we have a chance. I'm not going to lie and say that I think it's going to be easy. I think it's going to be very challenging. But I will say, if you can share this with your friends, social media, this effort alone will help educate tons of people. There have been so many people that have now learned about human trafficking that didn't know anything about it, and they're becoming aware of it. And I look at this as, even if we lose, and I'm hoping we don't this year, every time we push this out and we push the education out, we're doing tidal waves of information, and the public is getting more and more informed.
Thank you so much for your work, Tyson. We really appreciate you. Thanks for being a champion in the realm of human trafficking, and for your efforts for all these victims.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for everything Zoe does and that you guys do. It's huge, and I really appreciate everyone taking the time to listen and learn about this.
Yeah, it's been such a joy. We appreciate everything. Thank you, Dave, also for just all of your questions and everything you have to contribute. And thank you guys for tuning in and listening to the Light in the Darkness podcast. We hope that this episode was helpful to you, that you learned some new things. And if you do have questions, you can always send us an email at podcasts@gozoe.org. And until next time, we'll see you again on Light in the Darkness.